Hi there, Jack. My name is Yasmin. I don't know if you're male or a female, so please forgive me. Um, I did look at your question and I found it to be quite interesting. I have studied law, and I uh, I knew that this question is not the type that could be answered so easily. Okay, um, it has been a while, but the ramifications of the case of Citizens United versus FEC. First of all, it was a landmark case, and the ramifications have indeed affected every one of our three branches of government. The decision from that case has affected both of our lives and the lives of those that we care about. We can look all around us now and see the effect of this decision. The answer is obviously B. But is that what your teacher or professor was looking for? This, I have not a clue. However, when it comes to answering questions like this, one must take into consideration every possible angle that you would be talking about. You have to look at, it's going to take many hours, and we have to examine what was happening at that time in this country, in terms of the people, those who had retirement accounts, those who were wiped out in 2008, those that had money. Right there is an examination based upon many different factors, such as history and psychology, political science, sociology, economics, financial houses, banks, housing, renting, disease, soldiers of Vietnam, health insurance, welfare, rising houses, financial houses, banks, rising Social Security costs with less money in that fund, no savings, food prices going up, the advent of massive amount of drugs coming into this country that had come, interestingly enough, because of all of the mortgages for all of the houses that were being bought at that time. The systematic, um, how can I put it? There was a time in this country, I remember when I was a child. I can tell you best you'll understand it this way. And when I was a child, about 600 years ago, we used to say the Pledge of Allegiance in the morning, but we learned about the founding fathers of this country. And it was interesting. It started when we were in the first grade, but our teachers didn't sit up there and read us books. What our teachers did do was read us a story about the character of these men that would be our founding fathers, and many of them to become presidents. For instance, there's a story about George Washington when he was a teenage boy who went and got an axe out of the shed, and he cut down the cherry tree of his father. Cherry trees are quite valuable in an agricultural community, a situation like that. So his father came to him and he asked him if he was the one who cut down that tree. Now, you may know the answer, you may not, but his response was, "Father, I cannot tell a lie. It was I that cut down that tree." One of the characteristics that Alexis de Tocqueville would write about in 1835 in a book called Democracy in America, he would write about the characteristics of what made an American, because there was no other type of people in the world, nor will there ever be. He also wrote about the women in America who are vastly different than any women any other place in the world. And he wrote about those things that defined an American, such as characteristics, what went in to make our character. Well, right there in that story of George Washington becomes one of the first things about an American. We don't lie. We may make mistakes, and we often do. We make mistakes, but when we realize the mistake we have made, we try to rectify, to make amends immediately. And I think that we have always done that up until about 1978, 79. when Mr. Reagan became president of the United States. Interestingly enough, I don't think this came from Richard Nixon. I believe that it began at that time. At that time, when Khomeini came to power in Iran, the Shah of Iran left, they took Americans hostage. And they kept them in Tehran as hostages from the State Department for over a year. It was interesting to note that no matter how President Carter tried to talk them into turning over these Americans, that Khomeini refused. And President Carter even went to the point, because you have to remember that Iran was an oil producing nation. It still is. And the interesting thing about Iranian oil is that unlike Saudi oil, it needs much less refining. They have less of a storage of oil, unlike the Saudis, but their oil is of higher quality. It takes less refining, and therefore it's more expensive because you have to do less with it. We have sanctions against Iran, even to this day, after that occurred. And the way that the Chinese who have needed the energy to keep their great industrialization going, their source of energy is oil. So where do you think they've been getting it from? And they have been very much cozying up to the Iranians. And it's interesting to note that with COVID-19, this coronavirus, China said that they had a large, and when they first announced that they had it, when it was first revealed, I remember my father was over here and I said, you know what, Dad? They're lying about the numbers, because there's no way when the Chinese say something like that, given their nature, they will not, they must have gotten to such a point that the number of dead bodies, they could not hide that number anymore. And you know what? I was right. But at the same time, simultaneously in Iran, they had a huge outbreak of coronavirus. Many people have died over there in that country. At first, they thought that it originated in Iran. Well, we know that it didn't. It actually came from India, from an animal called a pangolin that looks like a scaly armadillo. It's quite cute, but it's also on the endangered species list. The reason why they would capture those animals is a very interesting story. Our genomists had already tracked that down by the middle of March of this year. We already knew. So anyway, I'm sorry, I digressed. But do you see that all of these things, when we had the mortgage meltdown in 2008, what happened was when President Reagan became president, when FDR was president of the United States after the Great Depression, he put restrictions on the financial houses so that this would never, ever, ever happen again. I mean, literally on one street, if you had 10 houses, 9 families were thrown out of their homes and the banks would take over. And that was because the stock market was booming at such a fast rate that, and they were allowed to buy on margin. Now, I don't know if you know what margin means, but at that time it meant you could buy stock. Suppose the stock was $100. You would only have to put $10 down to own that stock, and you could own $90. That they called margin. Well, since the stocks were going up in value, because stocks only go up due to the emotionalism of whoever is buying them. I mean, a clear-cut example of the truth in that is by a product company called Procter & Gamble. You should go and study it, because they were very profitable for many, many years, but their stocks started going down because most of them are just based, the ups and downs are based on the emotionalism of the human beings that are involved. Well, when he became president, after Nixon left, this country was feeling the fallout from Vietnam. You see, wars never end because somebody proves to be more right than someone else. The only time I've ever known that to happen in history was our Great Civil War. That was the only one. But all other wars, they end for this reason and this reason alone. They just become too expensive. Vietnam was no different. It just got to the point where the taxation on people was so immense. The Americans were threatening a tax revolt. That's why that war ended, and not because of all of this demonstration that you see going on, that you may have seen film on. So anyway, Nixon left. He did make sure he took us off the gold standard. You don't know what that is. And our dollar is based on the good faith of the American people. He had a reason for that, because the French tried to corner all of the gold and would have held us hostage had they been able to do that. Anyway, he left. Ford became president. Carter was voted in. Mr. Carter was a wonderful man. He really was. Just a wonderful humanitarian. He really was. But the thing that got him in trouble, you know, he had been in the Navy and had risen up. Was he an admiral or almost an admiral? He was an engineer, and his Navy experience was on a nuclear submarine. The man was no dummy. He was very brilliant. His problem was, though, he went and sent some Marines in to go and try to rescue the Americans that were being held hostage in Iran. When they landed with their helicopters, there was a huge snowstorm that got into the engines of these helicopters, and they crashed. And Carter, this is the reason why he lost the election. Everyone blamed him for this. It wasn't his fault. How could he be responsible for a sandstorm in the middle of the desert? He couldn't. But that's the quirks of history. He was voted out of office, and in came Reagan. Mr. Reagan, President Reagan, left office, and he had the absolute effects of Alzheimer revealing themselves to us. His wife, Nancy, it seemed to do very much like Woodrow Wilson's wife did. Woodrow Wilson, who was president during the First World War, suffered the last 6 months he was in office. He suffered from a massive stroke. He was almost like a human vegetable, but his wife had them lift him up and put him in the bedroom, and she would take the papers into him, shutting the big door so the rest of the world could not see. It has been said that she most likely was the one that was signing the papers and making the decisions. So it is not unusual for the First Lady to have that kind of stature in the White House, and she becomes the unelected president, but no less becomes the president. Anyway, Nancy tried so hard to hide this from us until by the very end, you knew there was something wrong. Very similar to Mr. Biden, although he doesn't have Alzheimer's. There is something neurological going on there. So I believe I went back and I looked after all this mess that's been going on. I went back and I looked at the film clips of Mr. Reagan when he came into office. And I believe that the signs of Alzheimer's were there at that time. In fact, he was being run around by everyone. I saw, who was his chief of staff? I saw a clipping where his chief of staff said to him, "You need to sign the papers now. We got to get going." I mean, who talks to a president of the United States like that? You see? So big business came in. Now, FDR had said, number one, the average person like me, if I wanted to buy stock, I could buy it on margin. But I could only buy 30% of it on margin. Because what happened with those people during the Depression is that the stocks started to crash because they just did. They just did. There were some factors involved, and then when their stocks went down, when their stock was worth $300 and they had only paid $90, or they had only paid $50 in. Now imagine that multiplied by about 3,000 stocks, issuance of stock. Your stockbroker called them up on the phone and said, "You know what? You owe us. You owe us $30,000 or $40,000. We're recalling your margin. And if you don't pay up, we're taking your house because you borrowed to buy that stock on your house." FDR, when he came in and became president, first thing he did in the first 100 days is he shut down all the banks so there wouldn't be any more runs. And then he asked the American people, please turn in every piece of gold that you have. kind of looked good on the books. It looked like we had some money. He was a very smart man. So he also said to the big financial houses, you know, the ones who do the stocks and the bonds and all that stuff, he said that a financial house and the banks could not be part of the same company. Well, you know what? And it was that way since Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed his name on that law in effect in 1933. In 1980, when Mr. Reagan became president, he went and said the financial stock brokerage houses and the banks could now be owned by the same corporation. Now, what do you think is going to happen when you let a situation like that occur? The worst possible thing did occur. You see, down in South America, where there was a proliferation of a drug called cocaine, and Escobar and all these drug lords rose up, and they were worth billions and billions of dollars, US dollars. But what were they going to do with it? They couldn't leave it in the banks in Colombia. Come on, they had to put it in the United States where it would be safe. So where did they put it? They went to these financial houses who made some deals with them, and they turned around and they said, okay, we'll take your money. Like if you give us 10 billion, the bank is going to charge you 10 million out of that 10 billion for us to launder that money for you, to make it clean. So they took that money and they made it clean by giving it as money for people to buy homes, to get loans. And so all of these mortgage bankers started popping up like mushrooms all over the place. And people who were making $1,000 a month, they went in there and signed their name on a contract to get a house, because here's all this money coming from that drug cartel, that drug money. And they said they were making $12,000 a month. Oh, and they all ended up with $700,000 homes. But what they got was what they call a graduated payment arm with negative amortization. Price of the mortgage payments started going up and up. Well, they turned around, the mortgage bankers, mortgage brokers who knew this was going on, and a lot of times would fill out the papers themselves, then took it and they would sell that mortgage to a bank. The bank, because the housing prices were going up, 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 the bank promptly turned around and sold, who is now owned under a corporation that also owned one of those stock brokerage firms. They handed it over to the stock brokerage firms. And those stockbrokers took each one of those mortgages. If you can imagine a bag with 300,000 mortgages in it, every hour on the hour coming at you. And they simply were taking a piece off of this mortgage and a piece off of this mortgage and a piece off of this one. And they were selling it to a broker across the street, who would then take his 300,000 and take pieces and mix them up with the pieces you gave him in the afternoon, and he'd sell it right back to you. And the price would go up and up and up. And then they got smart. You see, the United States is the only country in the world that backs its debt up 100%. People know that. We're the only country in the world that does that. Our debt, our word, going back to George Washington and that cherry tree. When we give our word, we don't break it. For anyone, no matter what hardship we have to suffer, at least that's the way it was until this happened. So they took all that debt and they sold it to the big banks in Europe, who sold it to another bank who sold it. And then all of a sudden, guess what? Guess what? The cost of the mortgages were going up every month. And the people who had gotten involved with them, well, now everyone, they knew they only were making $1,000 a month. And all of a sudden, their mortgage payment went from being $500 a month, all of a sudden up to $1,200 a month. How long do you think that lasted? Till they just walked away from the house. Now nobody was paying on it. And the mortgage banker who had sold that to the bank, and the bank who had handed over to the financial company, they weren't getting any mortgage payments. And then it got to Wall Street, and they couldn't figure out where they had sent all of this around the world. But they knew if they didn't do something about it, the whole world would collapse. That's what was going to happen. That's all because Reagan signed away the great regulation of these industries in this country. That occurred. We had what they called the Great Mortgage Meltdown in 2008. That was in September. You know, I don't think we have ever recovered from that. President Obama tried, but it was an impossible task. It was just impossible. But I'll tell you something more important that happened. Something more important, deeper that happened was there was a change within Americans, an ugly, ugly change, and it hasn't gone away. Sometimes, even before coronavirus, I used to feel like I was in a different country. This wasn't my country anymore, the one I had known. But my children were born and raised here. And I'm happy to say that I did raise my children exactly as I was in that regard. Now, back to your lesson. Do you understand how you must know all these things in order to answer that question? Did you know that in this case, one of the things that was predominant in this case was that a corporation, do you know what a corporation is? I hope you do. I don't know what your educational level is, honey. I don't mean to be condescending. A corporation was deemed to be like a human being with all of the rights therein. Think about that one for a minute. A company had the rights under the U.S. Constitution just as any human being was. That was decided by the U.S. Supreme Court in a landmark case called Santa Clara County versus the Southern Pacific Railroad Company. It is in that decision that not because it was deemed to be like a human being, because then a corporation was able to get what they call equal protection under the 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. 14th Amendment was designed to make sure that due process of law, equal protection under the law, not being discriminated against based on race, color, creed, to be able to have due process of law, which essentially was applied on the states. You see, the one that covered the federal government was the Fifth Amendment, that you cannot be compelled to testify against yourself. That's when they say, I refuse to answer on the grounds of the Fifth Amendment. That's why they made the 14th Amendment, to carry it forward. So they became like a human being. So when these cases come up in front of the Supreme Court, the first couple of cases that they decided that were going in that direction, they decided as though these corporations were a human being. You could not deny a human being to be able to speak his views or the way he thought or she thought under the law. If you did that, then you were taking away that human being's right under the U.S. Constitution to have freedom of speech, to think as we want to think. Even if everyone else thinks we shouldn't think that way, it doesn't make any difference. Under the law, a minority of one is though they are as a majority. Now, when they wrote this decision, the implications of this are so far-reaching. And the effect of this on us still is with us today. In order to answer this question, as it should be answered, would take many hours of research, because you'd have to examine what was happening at the time in the country in terms of the people and who had retirement accounts and other factors such as history, psychology, political science, sociology, economics, financial houses, banks, housing, renting, disease, gargantuan numbers of people coming across the borders who did not have visas, politicians that were without shame. Very easy to buy their vote. Very easy. It just went to the highest bidder. You know what? That hasn't changed. It's interesting how that particular case came into play to have that happen. Okay? Since 1980, when Reagan became president of the United States, first of all, he went and the United States had sanctions against the Iranians after they took Americans as hostage. Well, the Iranians got into a fight with the Iraqis, and Reagan knew he was the one who put the sanctions. No, it was Carter. It was President Carter. He really badmouthed the Russians, and so he knew that, and the Iranians looked like they were losing the war with the Iraqis. The problem with that was that Iran was right next to the USSR, which is Russia, and Russia had wanted a natural warm water port. You see, all of their water ports are ice locked 9 months out of the year, where they were at that time. So that's why they were trying to go through Afghanistan and had that war, because they were trying to get a warm water port. Well, he knew the Iranians hate the Russians. They hated them because they did not believe in God. Communism and Marxism. Communism is just a form of government of the theory of Marxism. They don't believe in God. And Iranians are Shia Muslims. When Muslims are hyped up about their religion, let me tell you something, they will not give up on that. When you don't believe in God, they don't mind. If you're a Christian or you're Jewish, they love you. They really do. In fact, to the Muslims, there are over 144,000 prophets, of which 12 are much admired. One of those 12 is, in fact, Jesus. He's considered the defender of the faith. And they are people of the book. The book, they're talking about the Talmud, written by the Jews. That's the part. In fact, the first 5 books of the Old Testament are from the Jewish Talmud. The story of how earth was created, and the Garden of Adam and Eve, and Noah's Ark, and all of that. But I am convinced, coronavirus or no coronavirus, we were headed for this. It's not just a financial meltdown for us. No, it's not that. It's that we, as a people, are becoming morally bankrupt. How could it ever happen that we would turn away from each other or turn to be on each other? You remember what Abraham Lincoln said? A house divided cannot stand. He was right. That's what he said before the Civil War in 1858. Is that not what we're doing now? And a case like this only helped it to happen. It speeded it up. I believe that it was the big HI. It was the historical inevitability that we would end up like this. This case happened to be one among the many that contributed to that happening. In fact, this case helped to speed it along at a pretty fast pace. Now, John, I will be more than... Oh, and I also want to tell you something. It is the law that causes the greatest, that contributes to the greatest strength of society, but it can also be the law that tears it down to its very roots. In fact, I'll give you a case. Are you ready for this? In 1781, there was a slave ship called the Zong. When they left, it was an English ship until the English outlawed slavery, and we followed suit, of course. When they started out to come from the coast of Africa to the Caribbean, there were 442 slaves. But the food started running low, and the disease started breaking out, as it always did. And within 2 months, 62 of these slaves had died. So Captain Luke Collingwood had to make a decision. You know why? Because all of those slaves were insured. Think about that one. I insure my car. I have health insurance. I insure my apartment in case it gets robbed. But this way, a human being had been insured. Now, you ready for this? When those 62 slaves died, and they weren't even close to the part of the world they were supposed to be in, there was no water, the food was running out, what Captain Collingwood read was this: if the slaves died from starvation, the insurance company would pay off on them, like when you get into a car accident. But I'm sorry, if they fell overboard, the insurance company would pay for them 100%. But if they starved to death, the insurance company was not going to pay 1 penny. Captain Collingwood made the decision, and that decision was, he told his men to get 133 of those black people and throw them overboard. And at the moment that they did that, the black people went from being human beings to chattel, to property. And property has no right under the law. Only human beings. Now, that is bad. You know, if they really, when they're out in the streets yelling and screaming like they are now, that is something to be angry about. And we should be joining them, because with this case of Citizens United versus FEC, because of Santa Clara County versus Southern Pacific Railroad Company, a company has rights like a human being. In 1781, a human being, their rights were taken away as a human. They were just an object. And then it reverses itself in 1886. The Supreme Court says that an object or company has the rights of a human being. And look where it led to. When you watch what's going on Capitol Hill on YouTube, we know what's up. I know what's up. That's the way they're acting right now is just because, in the case of Citizens United versus FEC, that a human being, a corporation, had the rights of a human being. And guess what they were doing with their money? Excuse me for a moment, honey. Excuse me. Allie, can you hold on for 1 minute? Allie. Anyway, and this is one of my relatives from overseas, honey. Wait a minute. Oh, excuse me, honey, I'm sorry. You see what I'm saying here? Just asking me that question. The question is, what's the result of the court decision on Citizen United versus FEC? A, it says choose one, right? A, individuals, union, and corporations can donate a large scale to political action committees. B, individuals, unions, and corporations can donate on a large scale directly to campaigns and are exempt from disclosure requirements. C, corporations are allowed to donate anonymously directly to campaigns on a large scale. You know what, Jack? Is that the way you want to answer that question? If I have not done what I was supposed to do tonight, which was to convince you to look further, because this case has a lot to do with what goes on in your life today, where you will be and where you may not be, but possibly if you become educated, you will get to where you want. I promise you that. Now, the choice is yours. I will be more than glad to help you, honey. Tonight, of course, I wouldn't ask for a penny. I felt kind of bad because I know what this is going to require. It's up to you entirely. You have to make the decision. Do you want to learn so that you have the knowledge, so that you will have choice in your life? Or do you simply want to answer it as A, B, or C, and be nothing more nor anything less than chattel? Choice is yours. Again, my name is Yasmin E, and I hope I have not bored you. And this is my nature. Um, I look at everything in great depth, and I take everything very seriously. There has to be some of us around who still do it. Wouldn't you agree? Anyway, let me know. If I can be of help to you, just let me know. But I'm going to tell you right now, it's not going to be for 1 hour. Okay? If you don't want to work with me on this, if maybe later on I can be of assistance to you, please let me know. I'll be more than glad to help you. Well, have a wonderful evening. Take care of yourself, huh? Yeah? Take care of yourself. Good night.